Carl Jung and Gautama Buddha are two of the most influential teachers the world has ever seen. But did you know that their teachings are very contradictory to each other? In this video, we delve into the teachings of the Buddha and Carl Jung. Why are they so different? And are there also similarities between the two? Before we dive in, please give this video a like if you can. That will help me spread the word. Are you ready? Let's go. The self is the central archetype of Jungian psychology. For Jung, it is the organizing principle, the process, and the goal of psychic growth. The non-self is the core Buddhist teaching. For the Buddha, insight into non-self is the organizing principle, the process, and the goal of spiritual growth. So are Buddhism and Jungian psychology at odds? Must you reject one if you are to embrace the other? The self-archetype and the non-self teaching appear as incompatible views on reality. At the same time, both reveal deep insights into the nature of experience. How are we to make sense of this contradiction? Common wisdom in academia has been to ignore the issue. How little has been written on it speaks to the difficulty of the task. This, I believe, is a missed opportunity. Jung and the Buddha have produced two of the deepest models of the human condition. We stand to gain much from building bridges between them. In this video, we will explore what these teachings say about what we are and what we are not. Let's hope we are ready for what we'll discover. When comparing Jung's self with the Buddha's non-self, what are we comparing really? We must define our terms first. Let's start with Jung. Jung does not make a big deal out of our everyday use of the word self. When you refer to your self, you are referring to what we all know you are referring to. In Jungian technical terms, you are referring to the ego. Jung writes, "By ego I understand a complex of ideas which constitutes the center of my field of consciousness and appears to possess a high degree of continuity and identity." The word ego has gotten a lot of bad rep lately, but here it has no negative connotations. Ego is not the enemy. It is simply the bundle of psychic content that makes up what we call I. Thoughts, emotions, sensations, memories, and other experiences tend to knot together. That psychic knot is the ego. The ego is flexible enough to allow for continuity through time. This is why your childhood pictures still feel like pictures of you. The ego cares little that there's not a single cell in common between your body and the body of the kid in the picture. So the ego's flexibility is coupled with enough rigidity to maintain identity. The ego acts as border police between I and everything that's not I. In disproportionate amounts, this rigidity turns into egocentrism or selfishness. But mostly, it is a healthy adaptation. You wouldn't survive long if you couldn't tell yourself apart from your neighbor or from the tree in your backyard. Such boundary dissolution occurs in mental illness and if people do psychedelic journeys, for example. Also, it appears in mystical experience and deep meditation. Something to think about. We've lingered on the ego just so I can show you this is what most of us mean when we say self. In Jung's work, however, the self is a technical term that means something different. The self relates to the ego like how the ocean relates to a wave. Remember, Jung defines the ego as a complex of ideas which constitutes the center of my field of consciousness. Complex is another technical term. In fact, Jung was so fascinated by complexes, he initially called his work complex psychology. By a complex, he means an unconscious focal point of psychic processes. Let me give you an example. Imagine a kid whose dad keeps walking out on him and his mom during arguments. What does the kid feel in these cases? He feels abandoned, unimportant, and unloved. What does he think? He thinks, "I'm not wanted, I'm not good enough." With time, these thoughts and emotions clump together in the kid's mind. They form a complex. When he grows up, the boy develops what we call abandonment issues. Even among friends, he suffers from anxiety attacks and feelings of inferiority and possessiveness. Oftentimes, he feels left behind and misunderstood, the odd one out. The boy has no clue, of course, of any connection between his anxiety and his childhood experiences. He would much rather blame himself or those around him for his condition. Those immersed in trauma are usually the last to know it. So this is how a complex develops under the radar of consciousness. A complex is like a reflex in the psyche. As such, it has certain autonomy. It can act without the ego's knowledge and against the ego's interests. This is why Jung calls complexes split-off components of the psyche. The goal of Jungian therapy is to make the person whole again. A big part of this is bringing complexes out of the unconscious and into consciousness. This way, we return their energy back into its source. We can understand easily how having abandonment issues is a complex, but Jung calls the ego itself a complex. We've seen that the ego is what we mean when we say I. This leads to the bizarre conclusion that you yourself are a complex, a reflex in the psyche. Jung writes, "The ego is only the center of my field of consciousness. It is not identical with the totality of my psyche, but merely one complex among other complexes. I therefore distinguish between the ego and the self, since the ego is only the subject of my consciousness, while the self is the subject of my total psyche, which also includes the unconscious." Okay, let's try to grasp this. Think again about the boy from our example. His abandonment complex forms from the emotions, thoughts, memories, and sensations of his childhood. He grows up feeling, "I am the odd one out. I'm not good enough." Compare this to what you feel you are, your ego. A lifetime of emotions, thoughts, memories, and sensations clumped together. As they accumulate, they create the image of an entity called I, an entity separate from your neighbor and the tree in your backyard. This insight is profound, but remember, Jung dropped the name complex psychology. I think that's because he discovered something deeper. Think of your dreams. When you dream, you can experience yourself as another person, even several different persons in the course of the same dream. This means the ego dissolves in the dream state. It can no longer maintain identity and continuity. Since the ego, the center of consciousness, is out, dreams are unconscious experiences, lucid dreams aside. At the same time, you can dream of events and people from your waking life. You can dream you are your waking self, even though you are unaware you are dreaming. This means dreams can recreate the ego. A frightening fact reveals itself when we consider this. You are unaware of your dreams, but your dreams appear to be aware of you. So aware, in fact, sometimes they reveal feelings and thoughts you didn't even know you had. They can even provide insights the ego did not previously possess. All this goes to show that while you, the ego, are experiencing life, something else is experiencing you. You are not conscious of that something, but it is conscious of you. You do not know what it is, and Jung too, ultimately, did not know what it is. But to work with it, he gave it a name. He called it the self. We read, as an empirical concept, the self designates the whole range of psychic phenomena in man. It expresses the unity of personality as a whole. Jung qualifies the self as an empirical concept. Like the Buddha, he avoids metaphysical claims. He insists on sticking with what we experience psychologically. And what do we experience? Well, our dreams, our fits of anger and bursts of inspiration, our intuitions, our intrusive thoughts and fantasies, our irrational urges, our Freudian slips. Through all these, we experience hidden forces at work within us. Forces we can neither control nor understand. This is the unconscious. But there's more. If we investigate seriously these forces, we find that while irrational, they are not random. They suggest a hidden mental life which responds to and influences our conscious life. They reveal something unknown within and around us that acts with a purpose. The most meaningful way of describing this something is to call it a greater personality. Why? Because that's how it presents itself, an immeasurably large self of which our ego is but an imperfect miniature. Jung writes, "The ego encounters a superordinate totality, of which one cannot say that it is the totality or the self, but of which it can be said that it has a self of its own. That is, it can be represented only in relation to the conscious personality in the same way as a superior organism can be represented only in relation to the inferior organism. It is the same case with the relation of the ego to the self." At first, this sounds pretty daunting, but if you think of the ocean and the wave, the notion of a greater personality might be a little less scary. Let's return to Jung's quote, The self designates the whole range of psychic phenomena in man. It expresses the unity of personality as a whole. The self is the whole person, not only the ego but the ego and all its complexes, which together present an order and purpose to the ego's experience. For instance, what Jung calls transcendent function is the complex of unconscious elements acting towards integration. Jung calls this process individuation. It is the path of growing wholeness. As a person individuates, he or she becomes more fully themselves. And who or what is the self? The self is the whole. The process of individuation works towards an understanding of the self in its totality. The ultimate goal is to bring the ego into harmony with the self. As we do this, the psyche's hidden potentials become manifest. Our talents, gifts, and deep insights come to light, and now the self is finally in the light of day. Let's see what the Buddha has to say about it. Recall the non-self teaching of the Buddha. The core idea is that the self is an illusion. There is no permanent, unchanging self. This is at odds with Jung's idea of the self as a whole and enduring unity. The Buddha did not mean we have no ego. Of course we have an ego. It is an important and necessary part of life. We need it to navigate the world. But it is not I. The I is an illusion. Let's turn to what the Buddha said about this. The self is a term used for a number of mental and physical phenomena which are constantly changing and which are mistaken for a self by ignorant beings. It is no more real than a mirage or an apparition. The Buddha means the ego's tendency to cling to its sense of identity and experience is a delusion. Such clinging leads to suffering. The ego is not the problem. The clinging is. He taught that the clinging self is an impermanent mental construct, no different from the mirage in the desert or the image of a person in a dream. In other words, the ego is part of the illusion. So are the complex and the self. The ego is an illusion created by mental and physical phenomena. It is a form of grasping at permanence in a world of impermanence. Even the complex is an illusion. Jung would probably agree. But unlike the Buddha, he believed the complex is a step towards integration. The complex points to the greater self, the whole unity of psyche. The self, to Jung, is the end point of psychic development. The Buddha, however, teaches that there is no such end point. The realization of the non-self brings liberation. Liberation is a state of freedom from the clinging self and the illusion of permanence. Is the self then a form of clinging? We have seen how Jung's self relates to the ego, not as an ideal but as a whole and undivided unity. The self is the organizing principle and ultimate goal of psychic growth. It is a complete unity which exists beyond ego and complex, not as a destination but as the guiding force of individuation. This does not mean Jung's self is the same as the clinging self the Buddha criticizes. Jung's self is not something we hold on to, but something we grow into. Individuation is a process of reconciling the ego with the whole self. In this sense, the self is an expression of wholeness rather than a delusion of permanence. So, is the self an illusion? It depends on the perspective you adopt. From the Buddha's point of view, the self is an illusion because it is a clinging construct. But Jung's self does not need to be an illusion. It is an evolving principle of growth. It is not something we cling to, but a dynamic process we engage in. In conclusion, Buddhism and Jungian psychology offer different insights into the nature of the self. The Buddha's teaching on non-self reveals the impermanence and illusory nature of the ego and its clinging tendencies. Jung's self provides a framework for understanding the dynamic process of psychic growth and integration. Both perspectives offer valuable insights, and they need not be mutually exclusive. By engaging with both, we can deepen our understanding of ourselves and the nature of our experience. There is nothing about this experience that is not either form, feeling, perception, mental formation, or consciousness. These five combine like the five notes of a single chord. This chord appears as one single thing. We call that thing I, or self. But the aggregates are simply automatic phenomena. They appear, disappear, and reappear according to causes and conditions. Within them we find no soul, no self, no individual, no person, no ego, nor do we find any such thing outside them. The dance of the aggregates is difficult to comprehend. So, in shorthand, we say there is self having an experience, living a life, thinking thoughts, making choices. In their slumber, people grasp at this label as if it refers to some real entity. The awakened ones, however, see the soul, the self, the individual, the person, the I as what they are, a fiction. This is a summary of the Buddha's position. He sees no problem with using the words self, I, person, and so on, as long as we understand they are a fiction. But pay attention. Fiction is not always a derogatory term. It can denote a category of truth. For example, money is a fiction. It is something we value because we all act as if it has value. The whole world revolves around this fiction. We've covered this before. Novels too are fiction, obviously. They speak of things we all know haven't happened. And yet, reading Crime and Punishment changed the course of my life. Corporations too are a fiction. You cannot see or touch Google, and yet you probably depend on their services daily. You're probably watching this video on their platform now. All these are, yes, fictions, but they are also useful and meaningful, and impact the world. Like any other experience, dreaming too can be analyzed down to the 5 aggregates. That our sense of self changes and dissolves in dreams supports the Buddha's non-self. It suggests the sense of individuality is not fundamental to experience. However, our dreams sometimes follow an elaborate structure. Any good therapist can point out hidden symbols in our most unassuming dreams. And as we've seen, dreams react to our conscious experiences. All this suggests that again, while we are not creating our dreams, something is. This something also appears to be wiser and more creative than we would assume. What would the Buddha say about this? Well, we're finally ready to discuss what we're here for. We have our overview of both the Jungian and the Buddhist model of the self. Now let's introduce them to each other. In the Bible, Jesus says, "No man can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other." We must remember this warning now. Building bridges between Buddhism and Jungian psychology is delicate work and involves many dangers. One danger is picking a favorite and reducing the other system to the one we prefer. We must be mindful of our biases, or they will take the better of us. Another danger comes from the fact that, as John Keenan says, there are too many Buddhisms and just one Jung. Remember, Jung died in 1961. For comparison, the first time Buddhist scripture was written down was over 4 centuries after the death of the Buddha. And the tradition would branch out both geographically and philosophically in many surprising directions. Imagine where Jungian thought will be in 2,000 years. My point is, we must be specific about what we're comparing. This is why the non-self teaching I presented is limited to the earliest teachings attributed to the Buddha. My description of the self archetype also follows only Jung's original writings. So here we are faced with an apparent polarity, self versus non-self. I say apparent because we've already seen some similarities under the hood. First, the Buddha's aggregates and Jung's complexes express the same central insight. That is, that a person is a construct, an interplay of causes and conditions. The aggregate of mental formations may in fact be what Jung calls complexes, but this is a minor point. Far more important is that both the aggregates and complexes tell us you and I are a process, not a thing. A major disagreement between Jung's self and the idea of totality in early Buddhism. Buddhist totality is impersonal, almost mathematical in nature. You produce dark karma, you get painful consequences. You produce bright karma, you get joyful consequences. The 5 aggregates come together at birth, fall apart at death, and recombine at rebirth, all according to karma. This cycle goes on, like a computer algorithm. Jungian totality appears to be different. It speaks to us in dreams and fantasies, fills us with irrational urges, and puts us in our place when we act unauthentically. Like the biblical God, Jung's self appears to take a personal interest in the life of the ego. But let's look deeper. Jung sees the unconscious as compensatory. If our conscious behavior tilts too much in one direction, the unconscious pushes it in the other. It compensates. We've already covered this. It is why, for example, sexual perversion is so common among celibate clergy. When the ego does violence to the impulses, the unconscious rises up to strengthen them. Now think about the Buddha's law of karma. That law states any violent action comes back in an equally violent reaction. In the same way, all the good you do, you will receive in the future. Notice the hidden assumption here. Both the unconscious and the law of karma balance our conscious actions. Well, any act of balancing needs a pivot point, a center. Both Jung and the Buddha suggest the existence of a middle way against which our thoughts, words, and actions are measured. It is the deviation from that middle way that produces either positive or negative consequences. Jung and the Buddha speak of a cosmic law of wholeness which generates experience and keeps it in orbit around a center. I believe this center is where the Noble Eightfold Path leads to. I believe it is what the Buddha calls nirvana. Jung, in turn, calls the image of this center the self, and the path leading to it individuation. But let's now leave the transpersonal domain and return to the person, the I. Jung and the Buddha slice up the person in different cross-sections. The Buddha sees subjective experience as the intermingling of 5 aggregates. Jung speaks of consciousness, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. That we find different frameworks here does not necessarily point to disagreement. Reality is too complex to surrender all its secrets to a single perspective. Let's explore how the Jungian and the Buddhist model can complement each other. Say you're watching a movie and you become obsessed with the main character. Your attachment grows so strong that you begin to feel they are a living, breathing person you love. But say something truly terrible happens to that character, some great loss or betrayal, a tragedy. What insight would then liberate you from suffering? Well, you must realize this character is a fiction. They've been created by a team of scriptwriters and performed by an actor. The whole experience is designed by a director and produced by a large team of professionals. It is then projected for your entertainment on a screen. It's all make-believe. This is what the Buddha teaches, that the self is a performance we get convinced by far too easily. Of course, his insight transcends our example. In the example, you understand the fictional character is not a real person in the way you are a real person. The Buddha tells us you yourself are only as real as a fictional character. There is only the karmic ocean of causes and conditions. The self is but a motion picture written, performed, designed, produced, and projected by that ocean on that ocean, for that ocean. Myself, yourself, the Buddha's self, we are all different motion pictures in the Hollywood that is the conditioned world. To step out of the motion picture into reality, into nirvana, means to wake up to the fact it's all make-believe. When you reach that point, life's tragedies affect you as little as the plot twists of a soap opera. This is liberation from suffering. But Jung, I think, has something to contribute here. Imagine someone goes to see a great film. Imagine they then walk out of the theater and say, it's all make-believe. The magic, the locations, the characters, how can you take this seriously? This person would be quite correct in pointing out the movie is, well, a movie. Their judgment would be sober. And yet, we cannot help but pity such sobriety. To see the artifice in art is good, unless it robs you of the meaning contained therein. I think it is the same with life. The Buddha teaches us to see through the fantasy world we perceive. This is his cure for suffering. Jung teaches us to spot patterns in that fantasy world. This is his method for finding meaning in our suffering. Jung delves into the content of experience, the Buddha into its context. We may each find one or the other approach more profound, meaningful, or true, but I suspect both are equally valid and necessary, and their effects on people are not too different. The non-self teaching shifts our center of experience from the small self to the conditioned world as a whole. The boundaries separating I from everything that's not I gradually dissolve until they no longer make sense. At this point, saying there is a self or no self is equally misleading. One's concerns and identity are no longer caged by the skin-encapsulated ego. Look up Thich Nhat Hanh to see this in action. This is what the Buddha's non-self does to a person. Let's now compare it to the effects of Jungian individuation. Remember, Jung calls the ego a complex. He also says complexes should be made conscious so that we may reclaim the energy trapped inside. Indeed, it is our very identity trapped inside them, especially in the ego. So, what would reclaiming that energy and identity look like? Jung writes, "As we become conscious of ourselves through self-knowledge and act accordingly, there arises a consciousness which is no longer imprisoned in the petty, oversensitive personal world of the ego, but participates freely in the wider world of objective interests. The complications arising at this stage are no longer egotistic wish conflicts, but difficulties that concern others as much as oneself. We can now see that the unconscious produces contents which are valid not only for the person concerned, but for others as well, in fact for a great many people and possibly for all. The Buddha helps us see our subjective self as an objective process in a sea of causality. Jung helps us see it as a process in a sea of psychic currents. Early Buddhism calls that sea-dependent origination. Later, Buddhism calls it emptiness. Jung calls it the self. Of course, differences and nuances matter, but a man dying of thirst should care little whether he receives water or H2O. We too should care little. And both Jung and the Buddha remind us that we are, in fact, dying of thirst. Christ warns us, "No man can serve two masters." When reconciling Jungian and Buddhist models of the self, we must see neither Jung nor the Buddha as the master. The Buddha claimed to be teaching the eternal Dhamma, a truth he discovered, not one he invented. And here is what Jung wrote near the end of his life. "When people say I am wise, or a sage, I cannot accept it. A man once dipped a hatful of water from a stream. What did that amount to? I am not that stream. It is the Dhamma, the stream, that must always be the master." Buddhist and Jungian psychology are but different hatfuls drawn from that stream. The Buddha was the first to warn people against becoming attached to his doctrines. So did Jung. Indeed, there's been some good criticism of both. For example, Jung's ambiguous descriptions of the self lead to confusion. In some places, he denotes the whole psyche as the self. In others, he treats the self as the central archetype in the psyche. But how can the whole and its center be the same thing? Is the self the psyche, or an image of the psyche? If it is the latter, then what is that which transcends and contains the self? The Buddha's non-self too has been criticized. A good recent example is Evan Thompson's book, Why I Am Not a Buddhist. There he writes, "The self that Buddhism targets as the object of self-grasping, the self as a personal essence, isn't the only way to understand the self, especially in the context of cognitive science and philosophy today. So, denying that there is this kind of self doesn't entail that there is no self whatsoever." This video might leave you with more questions than answers, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Here we're rubbing against the limits of what the human mind can conceive of and communicate. It is a tall task to even discuss these issues, let alone reach a conclusion. I hope this video fuels your own exploration of the world's collective wisdom. Today, it is getting increasingly costly to divide ourselves into religions and schools of thought. The questions facing us are collective, and so too must be our answers. We have inherited profound insights from generations past. Our task, should we live up to it, is to breathe new life into this inheritance. Thank you for watching, and please share your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious to hear what you think about all this. If you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Namaste.